Are you struggling to come up with original content week in and week out? Start a podcast. Interview your ideal clients, let them talk about what they care about most, and never run out of content ideas again. Learn more at sweetfishmedia.com.
You're listening to B2B Growth, a daily podcast for B2B leaders. We've interviewed names you've probably heard before, like Gary Vaynerchuk and Simon Sinek, but you've probably never heard from the majority of our guests. That's because the bulk of our interviews aren't with professional speakers and authors. Most of our guests are in the trenches leading sales and marketing teams. They're implementing strategy. They're experimenting with tactics. They're building the fastest growing B2B companies in the world. My name is James Carberry. I'm the founder of Sweetfish Media, a podcast agency for B2B brands, and I'm also one of the co-hosts of this show. When we're not interviewing sales and marketing leaders, you'll hear stories from behind the scenes of our own business. We'll share the ups and downs of our journey as we attempt to take over the world. Just kidding. Well, maybe. Let's get into the show.
Welcome back to B2B Growth. I'm your host for today's episode, Logan Lyles with Sweetfish Media. I'm joined today by Scott Taylor. He's known as the Data Whisperer. He's also the principal consultant over at MetaMeta Consulting. Scott, how's it going today, man?
Wonderful, Logan. Thanks for having me today. Excited to be here.
I am excited to chat with you. We're going to be talking about this false dichotomy between creative and data that seem like two opposite ends on the spectrum and how we can bring those together. Before we do that, I would love for you to share with listeners a little bit about yourself, why you're the guy talking about data. We've mentioned that you're known as the Data Whisperer. You've also been called the GaryVee of Data. Give us a little bit of your background before we dive into today's topic.
Absolutely. I think the Gary Vee thing came out of just my excitement, passion, and the way I'm so animated on stage. I definitely have that same kind of enthusiasm and a way to get inspirational in front of audiences. So Scott Taylor, the Data Whisperer, I've been in the data business for 20-something years, always on the master data side, which we can talk about what that is, what kind of data that is. But it's basically the foundational data that allows other data to work better, kind of bosses other data around, if you will. We can get into that a little more deeply. MetaMeta Consulting, we're about what it's about. So we help organizations tell their data story, which is different than telling stories with data. It's more around how do you convey the value of having enterprise data management in your organization and align that at the strategic level. That's really where a lot of these data managers want to go, is how do we stop questioning whether data it should be part of the organization or not, always having to prove itself, and just make it part of what the enterprise does. Just like sales, just like finance, just like operations. Nobody questions those departments, but data is always up on the block going, okay, why do I need this? And that's got to change for people to really embrace it.
I like what you say there, Scott. Unfortunately, it kind of makes me think of, a parallel in education where the arts are always on the chopping block. For good reason, there's pushback against that. And I think that's a good thing. And you kind of spoke to that on an episode of the Data-Driven Marketer with Pogorzelski over at OpenPrize. And I love the way you mentioned something, companies have more data than they've ever had before. And so they have challenges that they've never faced before, but they also have opportunities that they've never had before as well, right?
Oh, absolutely. That all rolled up in this concept of digital transformation, in really changing the nature of your business, the nature of your business model, being able to focus on customer and relationships in a much more scalable way, finding new ways to deliver all that stuff, rolled up in this concept of digital transformation. And data is the lifeblood through all of it.
Yeah, absolutely. So going back to the Gary Vee thing, we've touched on, your parallel with him. And as you and I were chatting offline, we touched on something that I heard on Gary's podcast a while back when he was being questioned about, is it brand or is it being data driven? And I think you're in line with my thinking here is that it's yes, and they're not actually, there's this false dichotomy of either I'm a data driven marketer or I'm a brand driven marketer. And we're going to talk about some areas where we can handle that intersection. But just in general terms, could you speak to that a little bit, maybe that false dichotomy and where there's actually more intersection than we might actually believe on its face?
Yeah, I don't know why it would even be a debate, right? You've got a brand and you've got a brand message, and you're trying to get that brand message out there in the most compelling way to your target audience or audiences in whatever format and whatever vehicle works. Data is part of that. There's no way you can do that by hand. You can't do that manually. And if you do, you're spending way too much time and money and you still won't have the effects. So data has to be part of that. The beauty of master data, and if I boiled it down to a single word in terms of its benefit, it is scale. It allows things to scale. It allows you to do something instead of 10 times 1,000 and instead of 1,000, 1,000,000, because it makes those machines work better. Those machines know what you are talking about, if you will, to kind of use that sort of personify all that technology. But and machines don't have a sense of humor. You got to feed them the right stuff. And this standardized data, which master data is, I define it as the common business data shared across multiple systems, applications, and processes. You need to have a standard identifier and taxonomy and structure around a thing like a brand. And a brand taking a message and putting it in a media vehicle, there's two entities that need to interact. And who owns that media vehicle, and what markets are they in? How does it get delivered? And what audience does it get exposed to in terms of segmentation? If I pick that whole paragraph apart, there's a lot of standardized foundational data in that comment.
Absolutely. So let's talk about a couple of areas, for practical purposes where this really comes together. You and I were talking a little bit offline about, how marketers can look at, for instance, ad IDs and UPCs and other, common foundational data points that they need to look at connecting so that they can have this consistent feedback loop of what's working, how do we segment properly, all those sorts of things. Can you speak to that a little bit, Scott?
Sure. And just to use a really big example, let's take Coca-Cola, right? One of the top brands on earth. Everybody knows what Coca-Cola is, but every system doesn't know it unless it's identified with a unique identifier. It's got a taxonomy. Diet Coke rolls up to Coca-Cola. It's a carbonated beverage, so it's got a category, and it's available in North America, right? So if we take Diet Coke as an example, and there are standard codes and taxonomies and structured data about this entity called Diet Coke, both on the creative side, Ad ID, which is a standard in the advertising and marketing and media space for advertising creative, works in workflows. It allows systems to talk to each other across the whole marketing and advertising execution ecosystem. So if I run ads and I do marketing, I want to see the effect of that. I would find that out. A really good way to find the effect of marketing is to see what it does to sales. But in sales for Coca-Cola, through cash registers, through retail establishments, there's a different code called the Universal Product Code, the UPC. So here you have two vertical standards that are really embedded in the parts of the world that they operate in. But if I run a message and I want to understand the effect, I've got to link those things together. And it gets way more complicated, right? Because Coca-Cola doesn't really distribute the product. It goes through bottlers. And, without getting through all of that, there's still this simple notion of you've got this standard data out there. First of all, use it. If there's a vertical or a piece of your ecosystem that's got a standard, lean into it, use it, and then find ways to connect those standard data sets together to get that kind of feedback loop that you're looking for.
So that's a really good example, Scott, a great example from a well-known B2C brand. Could you talk a little bit about, how that standardization and connecting of data points from marketing to sales might look, for example, in a B2B environment? Let's kind of run with that and speak to, some of the things tactically that B2B marketers can be thinking about as they look to, connect the data so that they're seeing the effect on sales, and then that is informing their creative, kind of back to the main point we're talking about here.
Sure. Let's talk about a very large macro trend in the marketing space, especially in B2B, ABM, right? Account-based marketing. So a lot of people who have that as an objective, as a strategic intention, you got to push back and peel the layers back and say, okay, what does that A stand for? It stands for account. Do you have a common account structure? Do you have a standard definition for customer and prospect? and partner, the relationships that you deal with. If you can't do account-based marketing unless you have a standardized structure around something like an account. And it can get into all kinds of complicated problems because most enterprise accounts, most enterprise prospects you might be marketing to could have multiple divisions. They could have sister companies. They could be in different regions. You want to get as granular as possible while also recognizing the hierarchy structure of that account. Because so if you send an ABM piece of creative to a division that is owned by a company that has another division that you happen to be suing, just to use an extreme example, that's a waste of a lot of time and effort, right? You don't want to make that sale to that sister division because you've got a big issue with the company at large. Again, an extreme example for dramatic effect, but it could be also, all right, you've got two different pricing scenarios going out to the same company. You've got two different sets of creative that don't really make sense if you put them next to each other because you're dealing with the same ultimate parent. So I keep coming back to this structural aspect of it. And I've got a set of terminology around that I call the 4 C's, which are kind of the basic structural tenets of how you codify a relationship for a lot of these systems that you'll use. And the 4 C's in order are code, company, category, and country. You've got a unique code for something. You've got a company hierarchy, so you've got that divisional piece. You've got a category structure because if you want to do segmentation, if you want to do any kind of vertical focus, if you want to understand market share, you've got to have a category structure. And then country or some form of geography so you know where everything. It makes a lot of data problems go away. You know, things are unique, you know who owns them, you know what kind they are, you know where they are. And that's a lot of data issues. And from that should inform your creative. This geography, this market has a different set of circumstances, so the creative might be different. This type of company uses our offering different than another type of company. So I've got a verticalization, customization part of my creative. Okay, now the account itself is very particular, and I want to focus on that with my creative, then okay. And then you want to unduplicate it. You want to make sure you're not, there's reach and frequency, but you want to make sure you're not over marketing to somebody by accident. So I can easily take an ABM strategy and, break it apart and go, okay, if you don't have these fundamental piece parts, that stuff isn't going to work.
It's story time, and this growth story is about search engine marketing. Okay, so the story revolves around eSub, a project management SaaS company specifically for subcontractors. Even though eSub had incredible customer retention, they struggled with growth. Being a niche service, they discovered that there was little demand expressed for their solutions within search engines. To take on this challenge, eSub hired Directive Consulting, the B2B search marketing agency. After refining targeting, pre-qualifying clicks with an ad copy, and developing custom landing pages, Directive was able to increase eSub's marketing qualified leads by 71%, while decreasing their cost per lead by 65%. I have a hunch that Directive can get these kind of results for you too. So head over to directiveconsulting.com and request a totally free custom proposal. That's directiveconsulting.com. All right, let's get back to this interview.
Do you see a lot of B2B brands starting an ABM strategy without any of these data points really figured out, or are they kind of getting it half right usually? What do you kind of see out there, tales from the street with, B2B brands that you see, because this trend of ABM, obviously is not going away at this point. So I imagine you hear some stories, you see where people are kind of starting out, where they're struggling, those sorts of things. Anything you can speak to, kind of common pitfalls, where they're sometimes getting it right, where they're missing the boat within these 4 C's, or just in getting their data together for a proper ABM approach?
Sure. It's probably the first C and the third C people have the most trouble with. So the first one being code, a unique identity for everything. People are struggling with all these duplicates, right? They've got multiple records for the same thing. Common misspellings. How many ways can you spell IBM, I period, B period, M, International Business Machines, Coca-Cola with a dash, without a dash. That's just common noise in everybody's file. And that's got to get fixed. because these duplicates give you a wrong, or these multiple entity records for the same thing give you a wrong view of what's going on. How many customers do we have? Well, it depends on what you define customer as, or how many. That's a different question than how many records we have. So most people, when they say, how many customers do you have? The answer they get is how many records. That's the wrong answer. Then when you get to sort of categorization, segmentation, industry verticals, I have seen people with databases where they've got, their number 2 category is other, because people just put that in there. It's easy. They're lazy or they don't know. So how do you market to other or other underneath that? Or, all miscellaneous, different things that salespeople might do or administrators might do to make a process be easier in that moment, but then have an aggregate set of reverberations across an enterprise that really can disable this kind of strategy.
Yeah, that's a really good point. I've seen that as well. Even that point of how many customers do we have, run a report and just see how many duplicates, even for, a smaller team, let alone, a growing, scaling enterprise size company. And the category as well. One thing we went through an exercise in our CRM recently is oftentimes, we sell to marketers, and with a strategy that we're implementing that's very account based, it's more important to us who that prospect account sells to than the industry that they are in themselves. And so it's kind of that category, thinking through that category piece, not only just the standardization and, like you said, not having number 2 be other, that just cracks me up as well. But there are other, it's kind of layered challenges there as well. So before we wrap up, Scott, I think, your episode on the other show that I mentioned really kind of dives into selling the importance of data and putting that strategically in front of your executive team. Here, I'd like to wrap up with anything else, especially for marketers developing their ABM program, trying to take it to the next level. You've offered some really good insights and things to be thinking about, ways to think about their data that makes it simple to think about these 4 C's. Anything else you'd like to add, parting words to marketers out there struggling with some of this stuff?
I keep coming back to one, master data is the most important data any organization has. So a lot of marketers may not know there's even a thing called master data, but if they're focused on trying to do a customer 360, if you don't incorporate the rest of the master data or base it off the master data that your organization is already maintaining, if they've got it, then that 360 is going to be a really small circle. It's not going to really be a true and the truth about that relationship. So don't dive in and say, okay, we're going to have our own silo called Customer 360 and a customer data platform, and we know it all, because your organization may have really important, really valuable data about that relationship that you're not leveraging. So make sure you understand your data landscape and the sources you've got. It will take more work, but it's worth it later because you'll have a bigger, more comprehensive view. And you'll get that true 360, or, 360 is kind of, very aspirational, but how do you get everything you can know about a relationship in a place where you can work off of it to inform the actions you want to begin to take? I think that's a nice way to think about it. Let's get it all here first and then be able to take action on it.
Yeah, because having a 360 view of maybe, 2 platforms that have data, your CRM and marketing automation, you're not capturing maybe your financial system and other systems of record to get that wider 360 view, right?
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. And again, really extreme example. What's your history, financial history with that prospect? There may be a reason it's not a customer, and it actually might have been your decision as a company to not make that a customer anymore. And you've got a hot sales guy who doesn't know, and he's climbing through, your CRM and goes, oh, this looks great. We never, did he know that they were bad bet on you 2 years ago or whatever the problem was? You've got to be able to do that. You don't want them wasting their time on that stuff.
Yeah, absolutely, Scott. Well, Scott, this has been a great conversation. For anybody who's not already connected with you on social or wants to learn more about what you and the team at MetaMeta Consulting are up to, what's the best way to stay connected with you, follow up with you after this?
Super. You can take a look at my videos. I've got a lot of them out there on LinkedIn. So if you find me on LinkedIn, that's the easiest way to find me, Scott Taylor on LinkedIn. If you Google Scott Taylor Data, I take up the whole page, so I'm proud of that. I don't take up the page when it's Scott Taylor, because there's a senator and there's all kinds of people named that. But Scott Taylor Data will find me. I'm on Twitter a little bit. I'm on Instagram. But my primary place to deliver the editorial content that I put out right now is LinkedIn. And there's all kinds of engagement going on in the conversation. So I think that's the right place for me to be.
All right, Scott, this has been a real pleasure. Thank you so much for sharing your data wisdom with all of our marketers and the rest of our listeners in the audience today. Thanks so much.
Oh, thank you, Logan. It was great to be here. And put your data to work. Everybody put your data to work.
We totally get it. We publish a ton of content on this podcast, and it can be a lot to keep up with. That's why we've started the B2B Growth Big Three, a no-fluff email that boils down our 3 biggest takeaways from an entire week of episodes. Sign up today at sweetfishmedia.com/big3. That's sweetfishmedia.com/big3.